the agreed panelists are let in the room. Everybody else who would like to speak, I would kindly ask you to use Q&A button on your bottom, so I can promote you later. I can let you speak later when we finish the first cycle of the comments from the panelists which are already present here. Firstly, I want to warmly thank you on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory in University of Belgrade for joining us today. This is the first event of the annual topic series, Horizons of Freedom. Basically, after having faced threats to our academic freedom, and after many of our friends and colleagues from the global academic community stepped in and raised their voice in support of the Institute that had always stood for the freedom of thought, also freedom of being critical, we are one of the rare institutions that still has that, I would say, the pleasure, but also the honor that is able to continue its work of practicing and promoting critical thinking. With this series named Horizons of Freedom, we want to explore the link between freedom and engagement as our core topic, basically here at the Institute. As we understand freedom as something which is central action guiding principle of democratic politics. Basically, we want to spark more intense dialogue between the antagonistic traditions of thinking freedom in the face of urgent challenges and threats, which are posed to the freedom and democracy today. And we are facing them all over globe, especially, I would say, in Southern Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe for the moment. And that's why basically we decided to start this series. Engaging for us also inherently means calling others to join the action. And I'm particularly happy today to greet Michael Walzer with us, a dear friend of the Institute, who is the first speaker who is opening basically this series, Horizon of Freedom. And he will speak today of political action as something which is very much linked to the engagement as our topic. I'm now giving a word to my predecessor, Petar Bojanić, who will say a few words about Michael.
Good afternoon to all, and good morning, dear Michael. And thank you for being with us once again. I don't know if it is possible to say we are all in one place, but I suppose we will be together for the next 2 hours. I'm here representing 2 universities and would like to remind us all that in 2010, Michael received an honorary doctorate from the University of Belgrade. This was an effort on my part, executed by a number of us, and it turned into a political move that engendered much controversy, petitions, resistance, as you remember, Michael. I remember that against the mounting disapproval of the university's decision to award the honorary degree, we were nevertheless able to hold an important conference on asymmetric war and the building of the rectorate. We even managed to catch some of the football World Cup that year. And I remember Michael and Judy knew even better than us the locals which cafes had the big screens and led us down Belgrade's main street to them. Michael is also a permanent fellow of the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Rijeka. We were hoping to host him there with his old friend, architect Peter Eisenman, who is also a permanent fellow and a big football fan. It must have something to do with being born in the state of New York in the 30s, and you end up a leftist and soccer fan. I would like to thank Michael once again for being with us with the Institute last spring in its struggle to remain independent. The latest issue of our journal, Philosophy and Society, features his text, Proportionality and Responsibility, and the weekly NIN last month published an interview with Michael that was conducted by Gazela and translated by Marijan Ivković, who will also speak today. I will not waste your time introducing Michael, but I will only thank him for accepting our invitation to this little colloquium around his book, Political Action, a practical guide to movement politics. Originally published in 1971, it was republished last year at the initiative of some Los Angeles high school students, as John Wiener tells us in the introduction to this edition. My suggestion to discuss this book is born of the belief that Michael has more to say than he penned in his own preface to the 2019 edition, although he might believe otherwise. I suggested this also because this book still feels fresh and current and is applicable and useful in Serbia, Croatia, or the United States, or France, or even Turkey and Belarus. Young people need it, as Wiener reminds us, because without their action, there can be no change. Without young voices, no victory over Trump is possible. Allow me to stay with this point for just a second. In the book of conversation published this year with Astrid von Büsekist, Pensez la justice, and we are also very grateful to have Astrid with us today. In the chapter L'engagement, Walzer speaks of the main problem the Democrats had at the last election, the very poor turnout of those aged 18 to 29. I would also like to thank Philip for being with us. I believe he will have something to say about election next week. This book is also useful to activists dealing with social change, dealing with engagement, civic engagement, and this is one of the key topics of research of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Before I turn it over to Michael to give us yet another, I hope, introduction to his book, even though the book has been written about already, I think Jason, Toby, David Reiner defended his PhD at Berkeley on it with myriad interesting points about it and Michael's activities in the journal Dissent. Allow me to trade a few incisive passes, to use football language, to Michael. Paraphrasing a passage from the first chapter, The Political Moment, where Walzer speaks about the grave, if not essential, danger of any engagement or political action, he recalls, I quote, the maxim of a Jacobin leader in 1793, on s'engage et puis on voit. In English, I commit myself and then I see what happens. Or one jumps into the fray, then figures out what to do next. Lenin credits Napoleon for this last line, although it cannot be found. And I truly do not know who the Jacobin leader is. I'm interested what precedes the book Political Action. What is the background of Michael's engagement? What was it that in advance or simultaneously bore this book out? Remember that in New York in 1972, Michael holds a famous lecture, Political Action, the Problem of Dirty Hands. Did this text and this problem emerge from the book or the other way around? Also, in 1971, Rawls published Theory of Justice, and Michael read this book before that in manuscript form. Also that year with Robert Nozick, he holds the course Capitalism and Socialism. Nozick speaks on capitalism, Michael on socialism. And with a few others founds the group Society for the Elimination of Lousy Philosophy, which I think is the remake of Wittgenstein's previous idea about eliminating poor philosophers from the business of philosophy. And he founds the famous, that means Michael, the famous journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. So in the hopes of hearing more about this background and perhaps the academic context of the writing of Political Action, let me quote Michael himself in conversation with Astrid. I translated. The philosophers from that group Harvard, tried to produce une philosophie engagée, engagement philosophy of commitment, of engagement. Michael and us, or Astrid, probably remember the exact choice of words in English. And Michael said, this was also my project. Please, Michael, be so kind to open today's colloquium. The Zoom is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I am enormously grateful to people who organized this conference and enable me to talk about a book that I thought was long lost. Its republication was a great surprise and a delight to me, and so I am eager to talk about it. I'll try to do three things very briefly. I will try to say something about the occasion for writing the book, and I will try to say something about some of its key points, the points that seem to me most relevant right now. And then I will say a word about where we are today. 1970-71 was a time of defeat, a bad time, a time to step back and reflect or worry about what had gone wrong. After the assassination of Martin Luther King and the rise of Black nationalism, the civil rights movement was no longer a coalition of different groups because the nationalists had no interest in alliances. They were determined to go it alone, which minorities really can't do successfully. And the anti-war movement was literally in pieces. Division had overtaken all the temporary unity of the period around 67. So there were Maoists and there were Trotskyists and there were the weather people who were domestic terrorists who wanted to bring the war home. And there were the remnants of Students for a Democratic Society, which had been the major part of the anti-war movement. And there were the Panthers, the Black Panthers. Sectarianism had overtaken the movement, and sectarianism was one of the things I tried to talk about and to talk against in the book. There were decades of where political action was essentially missing, or at least the kind of political action in which we had engaged in the 60s. And then a revival by young people in the struggle against America's gun culture, by gay activists defending gay rights, by the environmentalists, perhaps the most important of the movements, though it has not gained the ground we hoped in the United States, and the revival of civil rights in the form of agitation for police reform or abolition. And it was those high school kids that you mentioned, I think were active in the anti-gun movement, and they found my book useful, and their teachers were the ones who arranged its republication. Now, political action is, in a democracy, is nonviolent action. Politics in a democracy is nonviolent. We are hoping for a peaceful transition of power in the next weeks, desperately hoping for a peaceful transition of power. But nonviolence requires leaders and discipline. And those are I want to talk a bit about that today, because there has always been a tendency on the left to disparage leadership, and therefore discipline. Leaderless organizations are not likely to be effective or politically potent. So let me just say just a word about the importance of accountable leaders. And there is a strong argument against great men and their entourage. I talk about the dangers of entourage politics in the book. We don't like figures, they're always men, figures like de Gaulle or Churchill, rich, small, but too big for the movement. But we do need accountable leaders, men and women who are first among equals, who are able to make decisions, who are able to negotiate alliances, and who are able to enforce discipline. Those are absolutely crucial features of a political movement. I have a vivid memory of visiting a SDS community organizing project in Newark, New Jersey, sometime around 66, 67. This was community organizing. The idea was to bring what we called in those days community people, to bring community people into an organization fighting for better housing, sometimes reform of the police, but an organization of local. And the idea was that this organization should be led by community people. But it was very difficult at the beginning to recruit community people for leaders. There are always competent people waiting, but sometimes they don't come forward. And so the SDS organizer was the effective leader, but he pretended not to be. He sat at the back of the room, and some community person who wasn't yet ready to lead, but might be ready later, some community person was up front. And everybody got a crick in their necks from looking back for signals from the real leader of the movement. And when I visited, I talked to the real leader, who was Tom Hayden, now of there is now a documentary about the Chicago 7, the group that was indicted after the police riot in Chicago in '68, and Hayden is the hero of the movie. I told him, you have to sit up front. You have to be accountable to the people you are leading. You hope to be replaced. You will be replaced, but for now you have to be up front, and there have to be leaders. There also has to be a commitment to discipline. The march has to have marshals, large men and women with armbands who will enforce the peacefulness of the march. We always had trouble in the picket lines that we organized during the civil rights movement, when we were picketing stores in the North that were refusing to serve Black students in the South. And the picket lines had to be peaceful. We had to negotiate with the police. We had to agree not to harass shoppers who wanted to get into the store. And there were always people, very few people, who thought that this was the moment to begin the revolution. And we had to tell them, no, not yet. Right now, we just want to boycott these stores and force a change in their policy in the South. And that would be a victory. And that was the victory we wanted. So, so you need to enforce a discipline. There have to be marshals. That's what's been missing lately. There have to be marshals who express the commitment of the group and enforce the commitment. It doesn't always work, as we can see from the police riot in Chicago in 1968, but the commitment is nonetheless important. Now, the other theme that I want to come back to is the idea of coalitions. I said before that minorities like Jews, Catholics in the US, but above all, Blacks and Hispanics need allies. And they need to, and alliances often require compromises. The agreements have to be negotiated. There have to be people capable of negotiating and enforcing the agreement. Now, the aim of the movements that I participated in and that I'm trying to describe and that I hope are revived today, the aim is to bring pressure on elected officials to change their policies. But there is, and that's the aim of movement politics. Electoral politics aims to replace the officials. And obviously replacement is better than pressure. So the drift of a successful movement will be toward an election. But electoral politics involve even more compromises because the electoral coalition has to be much broader than the movement coalition. And the candidate that you end up supporting is likely to be someone who is well short of your own politics, but nonetheless a major improvement over the people in office. The anti-war movement disintegrated, as I said, into sectarianism. And some of us went into electoral politics. I was part of the campaign for Gene McCarthy, who, if he had won, would have stopped the war. Electoral politics, when you are changing the officials rather than just pressuring them, is the surest way to win, at least on the issue that you are most focused on. So just a word now about today. I have never been so frightened about American politics. I have never felt so tense. And I know who my enemies are on the right. I have no illusions about the character of Trump republicanism today. But in some ways, some of the most dangerous people are people on the left who are announcing that they're not going to vote because it doesn't really make any difference because both parties are bourgeois or merely the Democrats are liberal, but that liberal is insufficient. And I want to say a word. It's dangerous to get onto this subject. I want to ask whether Black Lives Matter matters. This is an extraordinary political movement. It has produced an uprising in American society that we have never seen before, much more extensive than anything in the 1960s. The participation of people, not only in the cities, but in small towns all over the country, has been extraordinary. But this is an organization proud of its leaderlessness and of its radical decentralization. So some of the Black Lives Matter organizations here and there are trying to register Black voters and to push people, help people get to the polls, and some are doing nothing like that at all. And there's a sense of frustration to see so much so good in the response to police killings, so much so good, but without leaders who can turn it into an effective politics. We will see over the next weeks whether Black Lives Matter matters. If there is a huge turnout in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Milwaukee, in Detroit, we will win. And if not, we may not win. And nothing is more important this time around than winning. I say somewhere in the book, it's better to win. Better is much too weak a word for our time. Right now, it's essential to win. And somehow we have to make sure everybody realizes how important this moment is. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much for these insights. I think they were very meaningful, especially for us here in this region, but this is very, very, very globally important, and we are all following very carefully what is happening in the United States and what is going to happen with these elections. With anxious, we are very anxious about this, so we understand. And now I would like to give a word to two guests of ours, Astrid from Busseki and Philippe Golub, who are coming both from Paris for this moment. Astrid was actually engaged with Michael in conversation on political theory. They are publishing now the book Justice is a Steady Work, which is going out in December this year. And Philippe is also coming from American University of Paris, and he's teaching there history and politics. We basically wanted to invite those who are very much familiar with Professor Walzer's work to give brief comments in the beginning, and then I will allow Professor Walzer to answer them, and then we are going to continue with Sergej and Marian from our institute with their comments. Astrid, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, I'm many thanks to the conveners, and I'm very happy to be with you, and especially happy to see Michael. We haven't seen each other for a while now. I will ask some falsely naive questions, some of them also leaning on our long conversation and maybe the overlaps between this book and our conversation. But I'd like to begin by reminding you all that Michael is a very early activist. At age 13, he published a hectograph. He had to teach me what that word meant, that his mom sent to the White House, and actually Harry Truman responded. For other secrets about Michael's life, please read our book. So he was basically an experienced activist when the Dissent editors sent him down south to write about the lunch counter sit-ins he just talked about. And the articles he wrote at that time, The Young, A Cup of Coffee and a Seat, Politics of Nonviolent Resistance in 1960, Young Radicals in 1962, and his participation in various committees, student organizations, and groups in the 60s have probably, I would say, led not only to the writing of this manifesto on political action, but have probably more broadly shaped a life and a career. Small theories, social criticism that opens transformative possibilities, raising consciousness, forming coalitions, you just said so, Michael, giving up on the correct ideological position and so forth. I think all these are lessons of modesty drawn from these early political experiences in the South. So I've been told I have only 5 minutes, so I will just ask 2 short questions. And actually you already stole one from me because you've answered it in advance. The first one is about something you said in the late 60s in Dissent, where you write that the opposition to the war has changed American culture for the better in many ways, but it did not produce a sustainable politics. Its institutional legacy is virtually nil. Do you still agree with that? Because I'm asking because the problem it seems you raise here and also in the foreword to the 2019 edition is with the shift from citizen politics to electoral politics or institutional politics. And you draw from examples from your own experience you just mentioned with the SDS and the CNCV, and where you say that going national actually meant division. So the shift from citizen politics to electoral politics actually in this case meant division, and it often means division. You at that time believed that the time had come to do electoral politics and supported McCarthy, Eugene. So is there a recipe for the right time? And in America today, it seems obvious, but more generally, is there a right time? I think this relates to what you just mentioned about the traditional hostility to leadership, as with Occupy, or more recently, the Yellow Vests in France. And the Yellow Vests still vaguely exist, but they resisted leadership and they have almost disappeared, although they have one guy running for presidency in France in 2022, but he has, of course, no chance whatsoever. So that's the first question, the shift from one type of politics to the next. The second one is also related to what you said about Black Lives Matter. In The Young, in this paper I just mentioned, you quote one of the sit-inners who says, "We don't want brotherhood. We just want a cup of coffee and sit down. If we negotiate, my grandchildren will still be worrying about that cup of coffee." Now, how has that changed today? Wouldn't you say that it is about brotherhood today and that it is about substantial recognition, or rather that it should be? And I have a sub-question here, but you already answered this. The solidarity around Black Lives Matter seems to be indeed about brotherhood, seen from the left at least, and I think the movement is hugely and massively important. But the death of George Floyd and so many others also seems to prove that structural racism still exists and is still around, and very much so. I don't have a specific question here, but in the 60s, and we talked about this, interracial movements didn't really work out. And it seems to me that they don't really work today either. So that's a comment. Another change may be, and this is, I'm not sure, but you will know the answer. I think there's a very strong politicization of communities in general today, seen from Europe in America. And this new and strong form of identity politics on campuses in particular seems to be at once a sign of solidarity with the vulnerable and the oppressed, but it also brought about very sharp divisions, social divisions between the micro societies of students in urban areas and the country at large, but also political and ideological divisions with the specter of rewriting history, cancel culture, and all of that. So in one sense, students have always been the vanguard of social movements, and you're one of the best examples, but in how far has their role and maybe even more their responsibility changed today? That was a long second question with a couple of comments in between. And lastly, I would like to conclude with something that you say in the coda of, in the conclusion of our book, where you say leftism right now has to be a defensive politics. And you say we have to minimize backsliding and make up for lost ground. And you add that leftists today must pursue a politics of kindness for our contemporaries and for ourselves. And you said this often, we have to argue softly, even when injustice makes us angry. Do you think that's enough today when adversaries shout so loudly to continue to argue softly? I'll stop here. I have many other questions, maybe for later on.
Thanks a lot. There were very complex questions here, so I would allow Professor Walzer to answer immediately before going to Philip for the next round.
Yes, well, that's a goodly list of questions. I'm not sure I can answer all of them in the time that I have. But let me say a word first about students, because that was in 1967, the anti-war movement went into what we called community organizing. I talked about that earlier. And the form it took in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was co-chair of the Cambridge Neighborhood Committee on Vietnam, we sent people to knock on doors to look for a family that would offer their home so we could hold a block meeting and argue against the war. And we pushed for a referendum in the city of Cambridge about the war. And we succeeded in getting enough signatures to hold a referendum. And 40% of the voters voted against the war. But we lost every working class district in Cambridge. And that was a blow, because we were young lefties who thought that the class struggle was important and that the workers should be on our side. But what we were doing, we were the people knocking on doors were mostly student activists. They were exempt from the draft. They were knocking on doors of families whose kids were in Vietnam. That didn't work. And that was the first sense, this is 67, that was the first sense of the drift of white workers away from the Democratic Party, away first from the anti-war movement and then from the Democratic Party. So you can't do community organizing if you are ignorant about the community. It's very, very important to know something about the people whose doors you are knocking on. And had we known what seems obvious now, we wouldn't have sent draft exempt students to knock on those doors. So there is students tend to be in the United States, middle class and upper middle class, not always, but mostly. And they can organize each other, they can organize the world of their parents, but they can't reach out the way a left movement has to be able to do. And let me say a word about how do you know when to shift from movement politics to electoral politics? Well, in fact, what we always need is a division of labor. The movement isn't, I called it a pressure on public officials, but it's also an educational movement. In order to pressure public officials, you have to build up public opinion of a certain kind. You have to turn the public against the war or against the police. And that effort has to continue, even as some of the activists begin making deals with a political party and looking for a candidate that they can support. There won't be, for example, there won't be a significant reform of police conduct in the United States unless there are changes in city and state governments. The American police are radically decentralized. There are literally 18,000 police forces in the United States, relatively autonomous, controlled locally, but not nationally. So there are many, many elections that have to be fought and won at the local level. And that has to happen while the movement continues to bring pressure and to educate the public. Why are we on the defensive and why do we have to speak softly? Well, maybe in the era of Trump, not too softly. We are on the defensive, obviously, because enormous harm has been done to the American political system in the past 4 years, and we will spend the next 4 years repairing that harm. Now, I am very happy to watch the evolution of Joe Biden, who began running as if he wanted to be a successor to Obama, and is now running as if he wants to be another Franklin Roosevelt. And that is a major move. And if he really attempts to do the things on the environment and on healthcare and on civil rights that need now to be done, that will be more than defensive. A lot of it will be making up lost ground, but there is also new ground to be conquered. And if he wins and if we control the Senate, I hope, yes, we will be defensive, but there is some offensive work also to be undertaken. I don't agree that the biracial movement of the early 60s, led by King, who was a genuine coalition builder, that movement was successful, partly successful. And the success is most clear in the civil rights law of 1965. Which the voting rights law, which greatly expanded the participation of Black Americans in the electoral system, and which now the Supreme Court has eviscerated, and Republican local officials are doing their best to repress the Black vote. But that was a victory, and it was definitely the victory of a biracial coalition, which was lost after King's death and after the rise of Black nationalists. I understand the nationalist impulse. There was a desire not to be portrayed as victims in need of help, in need of white support. There was a desire to stand proud. I think it was a mistake to think that in order to stand proud, you needed uniforms and guns, which invited the very brutal repression that the Panthers, that ended the Panthers much too quickly. So I understand the impulse, but it doesn't. You can't do it. It's a lesson American Jews learned long ago, and Martin Luther King understood that you need alliances, you need help. You don't have to beg for the help, but you have to be willing to accept it. And that was lost at the end of the 60s, and it was a disaster for American Blacks and for America.
Thank you for a comprehensive answer. I'm now turning to Philip for his comment.
First of all, I would like to thank the Institute very much for this kind of invitation, and Michael Walzer.
You're a little soft. Can you?
Well, you were suggesting to speak softly, so I was speaking. It's actually not necessarily my usual practice. I would like to thank the Institute and thank you, Michael Walzer, for the opportunity to dialogue with you. And I'm going to, like Astrid, make a couple of very short comments and then raise some questions. One of the issues that's raised in your book and in your discussion here today is the distinction between incremental change, politics as incremental change, driven by normative goals, and on the one hand, on the other hand, more transformational politics that would actually change the nature of the structure of both political debate and of the institutional system. The latter, you argue, is a utopia, a no place that we cannot achieve. We have not achieved it in the past, and we are probably not going to achieve it in the future. Whereas the former, the incremental politics, the electoral politics, and the movement politics are susceptible to actually achieve some measurable results that can actually translate into a marginally better society, or even possibly, I don't know where you set that goal, a significantly better society. I think one of the issues that I want to raise there is that in times of very deep and often intractable social and political crisis, in times of deep and often intractable social and political conflict, because of course politics is also about conflict. Politics is not only about polite debate. Politics is not only the discursive dimensions of debate that Habermas has talked about. I wouldn't go so far as Foucault and say that politics is war by other means, but I do think that there's an irreducible element of conflictuality in politics, which of course you know very well about since you participated in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, where the violence was on the other side. The violence was on the institutions, on the part of the institutions, local and federal, on the other side. How do you meet that violence? How do you meet the difficulty of overcoming these institutional resistances that themselves carry coercive potential? What I'm trying to say here is that in times of crisis, it's difficult to try to tell people who are in motion, social movements that are in motion, to speak softly. Sometimes it's impossible to speak softly. Black Lives Matter speaks not so softly, actually, even though it's decentralized in leadership. A lot of the messages are not soft messages. They are messages tuned to hard times, tuned to the fact that 50 years after the publication of your book, and 55 years, 60 years after the civil rights movement actually took off in a very significant ways and actually made significant inroads in the rights revolutions in the 1960s, 50 years later, 60 years later, we can see there's a recurrence of the patterns of institutionalized racism, as Astrid pointed out, and of institutionalized, actually, I think we can go a little bit further, institutionalized forms of racial domination, despite some progress that has been made, obviously, in terms of the rise and emergence of a Black middle class. One of the issues which I think needs to be addressed in our discussion, I would like to ask you about it, is the role that social inequalities and the question of social equality plays in your thinking here. Because one of the characteristic features of the various forms of domination that have emerged over the past, that have always been there, but then that reemerged in recent decades has been the vast inequalities that characterize social conditions as well as political conditions in all of the West. This is true of the United States. This is particularly true of the United States, of course, where there are obscene differences of wealth concentration in different parts of the population, but it's also true in Europe to varying degrees. Inequalities, those inequalities cut across, as Nancy Fraser has argued for years and years and years, cuts across race and gender. And my question is this, you know, in the various problems that we face, the democratic recession, which is not only a US problem, it's also currently very much a European problem, the democratic recession in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. I think in Western Europe, we have similar, though less acute forms of democratic recession. In France, we are living under the equivalent of a permanent state of emergency. You have the social regression, you have atomistic individualism, and you have, and I think Astrid was right to point this out, exclusionary cultural and identity politics that have to some extent, not completely, but to a significant extent taken the place of social and political debate and social political struggles. My question is this, where do you set the normative goals that would allow us to cut across these different social groups? Black Lives Matter is also, Black Lives Matter is a cultural issue, but it's also a socioeconomic issue. It's also an issue of inequality. The lives of women, gender issues in the United States are issues of recognition and culture, but they're also issues of inequality. Occupy was leaderless, that's true, but Occupy generated, on the basis of its struggle against inequality, generated the youth movement that ultimately became the forces behind Bernie Sanders's successive candidacies, and that has had significant success recently in gaining positions, institutional positions, precisely what you're talking about in the House of Representatives. My question to you is, where do we set the normative goals? Do we simply stick to the realm of the possible, as would be implied by a leftism of, a quiescent leftism, or a leftism of fear? Or should we set higher normative goals that actually have more transformational potential, rather than simply incrementalist visions of political change?
Yes. I don't want to be a minimalist at this moment in the United States. We do need big changes, but we have to think about how they can be won. Bernie Sanders is a good social democrat. His politics in Europe would be what, center left. He is actually an advocate of the New Deal. And when he talks about American examples, he talks about the New Deal. And the New Deal was transformative in some important ways. It began the creation of an American welfare state, radically incomplete, and it enabled union organization. So that kind of a politics seems to me to be within reach today. And I also think a politics of that addresses the most immediate racial atrocities and humiliations is a politics within reach. You said there's now a Black middle class. There is also now a Black political class. And its expansion, represented in some ways by Kamala Harris, is an important feature, although I have to say that the inclusion of more and more Black men and women in local police forces has not produced the changes in police conduct that we expected. But so one way of thinking about social inequality is to think about its causes. And I understand automation and globalization, but for me, it is very, very important to address the failure of the left in recent years. And in the United States, the way in which Democratic Party politicians adopted a neoliberal economic agenda, which literally abandoned what had been the working class base of the Democratic Party. Now, that was a base drifting away, partly because of war and civil rights, but nonetheless a base that could have been held to a much greater extent than it has been held. It is astonishing to me that Democratic presidents like Clinton, like Obama, did not take action that they could have taken to make union organizing easier, to address the radical decline in unionization, which is one of the main causes of social inequality in the United States today. So a politics of unions, a return to the Wagner Act of 1935, which made unionization easier. And now it is virtually impossible because of the power of employers and of courts that support the employers. So I don't know whether that's a big enough transformation, but that is the politics that I think we need right now. I don't think it is useful. Here is where I use the word utopian as a pejorative term. I don't think it is useful to call for the abolition of the police. Radical reform is necessary, and I'm not sure exactly how to do it, because various efforts that we thought would help, like the hiring of many Black and Hispanic policemen and women, hasn't helped. But talking of abolition is a way of, well, I mean, even defunding the police. A recent poll showed that over 50% of Black Americans want more police in their neighborhoods, not fewer, not less policing. They believe rightly that their neighborhoods have been under policed, which is one of the reasons for the levels of crime in those neighborhoods. So yes, if you're going to organize, you have to know the people that you're trying to organize. And we are not in touch the way we should be with white workers, and even with Black Americans. So a return to, and I argued this in a piece in Dissent some years ago, a return to class politics is also one way of addressing the problem of identity politics. It has become a bad response to Black Lives Matter to say all lives matter. That has become the response of the right. But there should have been a response from the left, taking the form of, yes, Black lives matter, Hispanic lives matter, Asian American lives matter, Native American lives matter. And that there was the possibility of a coalition. The group that is killed by police most disproportionately are Native Americans, especially in the American Southwest. But Hispanic Americans are less disproportionately killed, but still disproportionately killed. And so a campaign against police atrocity should be a coalition campaign. And in order to do that, you have to know something about the Black community and the Hispanic community and the Asian and so on. So I want to be transformative within a context of respect for and commitment to actual people on the ground. So if white workers are increasingly unemployed or underemployed and attracted to a kind of populist, right-wing populist politics, we have to address the employment of white workers. And if Black communities believe themselves to be under-policed, we can't organize a campaign to abolish the police. That's not gonna work. So yes, transformation, God knows we need that. But with some acknowledgement of the world that we hope to transform.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would now give a word to Marian Ivkovic, critical theorist from Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Marian.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. My question concerns one problem that you deal with toward the end of the book, and namely that's the problem of something we might term the long-term effects of the degeneration and the corruption of representative democracy on the general political climate within which citizen activism is conducted. And this held true for 1971 in the United States, and it holds even more true for present day situation we find ourselves in. And you notice with regard to the United States in the early 1970s, that the growing degradation of US democracy, the growing disconnect between the institutional system of representative democracy and the citizenry resulted in a growing sense of powerlessness on the part of the citizenry. And you then argue that this sense of powerlessness transforms in complex ways the political climate of civic activism in such a manner as to foster to an ever greater degree a certain kind of defeatism, a subtle sense of defeat already anticipated at the start of political engagement. And this defeatism in turn results in a certain propensity on the part of engaged citizens to strive for forms of action directed toward some kind of immediate effect, a disruption of some kind or an immediate change that would demonstrate that the citizens still have at least some agency left. And this kind of climate of defeatism also results, as you argue, in an ever greater obsession of the activists with pure political identities, with ideological coherence, and with distinguishing oneself from other political actors. It results in what you call the searching out of enemies in advance, the labeling of others enemies on the basis of their first reactions. So it's a complex syndrome which then transforms fruitful political initiatives into something that someone might call sectarian, futile, self-indulgent politics. So my question is, if the long-term corruption and degeneration of representative democracy, which we are witnessing, creates such kind of detrimental climate for citizen politics, climate that in a way pushes engaged citizens towards sectarian purity, polarization, and thus in the end defeat, aren't we then facing one paradox, namely that in order for citizen activism directed towards single issue struggles to not end up in that kind of futile exhibitionist and self-serving politics that is the result of the general climate of powerlessness, we first need some kind of substantive modification of the very political system of representative democracy that would re-establish the general sense of empowerment among the citizens, if not actual empowerment, at least a sense of empowerment, as a crucial precondition for the kind of political action that you advocate for in the book. So don't we need some kind of modification of the political system toward greater participation of the citizenry, such as some forms of direct democracy, participatory or deliberative democracy, only in order to re-establish the preconditions for civic activism, for single issue struggles, and for gradual incremental societal improvement that happens through this logic? And then how does one go about solving this paradox? Thank you very much.
Yes. You know, in the way back in the 60s, there were already people talking about the sense of powerlessness. And there was certainly a politics of self-indulgence, do your own thing. There was in the 60s a separation. The big civil rights and anti-war marches were, as I said, highly disciplined with marshals, and they were always big men and women with armbands who enforced the peacefulness of the march or the demonstration. And then there were the urban riots, which were sometimes called uprisings, after the death of Martin Luther King, after the incident with the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles. There were these riots which literally tore up sections of the city, looted stores, burned cars. But these were separate phenomena. And maintaining this separation was actually very important. Now, one of the things that's been happening here in the United States since the police killings became a major issue is that the separation is gone. There will be a peaceful demonstration starting in the late afternoon, and as soon as it gets dark, it will be transformed into looting of stores and burning cars and so on. Some of that is due to right-wing provocation, to people who come in at the end in the dark and begin the violence, but a lot of it is the protesters themselves expressing their sense of frustration and anger. And there are no marshals to stop it. And that has, and I think the Democratic Party made a big mistake in not from the beginning condemning the riots, supporting the peaceful marches, condemning the riots, calling for the kind of movement discipline that makes for an effective politics. So self-indulgence isn't new. What's new is it seems to have a greater acceptance within some of the contemporary political movements, not the anti-gun movement, not the and not the environmentalist movement. The attacks, the critique, the campaign against globalization, which was very brief, but produced in Seattle or other West Coast cities, produced or brought out a kind of a politics that called itself anarchist and was deliberately violent in smashing stores, etc. That, I think that's a politics the left has to reject, and we have to embrace the discipline of a movement. And I think the problem with the anti-gun activists or the environmental activists isn't that they aren't committed, disciplined, and it's not that they don't feel they have a chance of winning. It's just that they haven't won. Yeah. And the repeated defeat of people calling for gun control and environmental regulation, effective environmental regulation. Yes, that may breed a sense of powerlessness, but I think compared to the 70s, 80s, early 90s, we now have more people engaged in the kind of political action that I believe in. It is fragmented because the gun people are just gun people, and the environmentalists are just environmentalists, although that's a pretty big political issue. And the campaigns against the police have nothing to say about the environment or about guns. So we do need the kind of unity that only comes in electoral politics. When a political party adopts several of these programs, as the Democrats are beginning to do, we now have a Democratic Party more strongly committed on environmental issues, on healthcare issues, on civil rights, maybe not on guns yet, but still, I think it has to take that form. The movements should continue in force, I hope, repeatedly renewed because people burn out in this kind of politics. Repeatedly renewed, but ultimately it's going to take a political party with a commitment across a number of these issues to give people a sense of effectiveness and empowerment. Now, populism is already a massively participatory movement. I'm not sure I am happy to see the crowds that come out to hear Donald Trump. And many of those people are mobilized in sometimes in militias, smaller numbers of them in militias, but also in the evangelical churches, in the National Rifle Association branches all across the country. I think we need a strengthening of the party system, of the representative system. We need a stronger commitment to local politics. The left has always been focused nationally and weak locally. We need a lot more local political engagement. I'm not sure that I'm ready for a Rousseauian direct democracy. I'm not sure that would be a good thing for us. I'm sorry to say that, but I want citizen participation. And I want governmental structures that are responsive to citizen participation. But I don't accept the claim of direct democracy that majorities can do what they want. I am a strong believer in what you might call liberal democracy, which means majorities have to be restrained by civil rights and human rights. And that restraint should come in an effective political system by the courts, from the courts. And that's exactly where it's not coming right now. So one of the goals of any left politics is going to be, and as we're talking about this more and more, is how to reform the judicial system, which has been politicized and taken over by the right. And one response is to politicize it further and take it over from the left. And that may be necessary, although the goal should be judges who are committed to the rule of law and not to, on the one hand, not to laissez-faire, and on the other hand, not to from each to each. Let them be just concerned about enforcing civil rights, human rights, sustaining a democratic electoral system in which everybody has a chance to participate. So I am still an institutionalist, I think. And populism, even left populism, makes me very nervous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we have the rest of the prepared panelists, Srđan Prodanović, and then there are 5 people who already posted questions in the chat. I will read some of them, but some of them I will let them in so they can ask personally the questions. So Srđan, the floor is yours for the moment.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to debate this truly sincere, I would say, and thought-provoking book. And in the interest of time, I will keep it really short. I will start with a quote from your book, which says, "New political movements generally take shape around a single issue, a wrong being done to the people who join or to some other group with whom they have political connections or moral sympathies. The activists are likely to disagree about much else, but this sense of injury or indignation they must share." This started me thinking about, however, what about those instances of injustice where this sense of injury or indignation cannot be articulated as easily, as is the case with the so-called epistemic injustice, to which also Black Lives Matter also relates in some sense. So my question is, first one is, can there be a political action regarding these kind of issues? And indeed, how do we organize social movements when we have these instances of indignation? And furthermore, although it seems not to be connected to this kind of issues, but I want to raise a larger or more abstract question of what is the role of social theory and philosophy what the relation between philosophies and social theory and political action. How do we see this connection? How do we articulate it? Okay, so thank you again.
Yes, I have an old argument with the Frankfurt School, and I've had a very interesting and very, I think, very sweet disagreement with Axel Honneth, and we have exchanged articles. And the question that I posed and to which we gave different answers is a good social theory necessary to successful political action? And he thinks yes, and I think probably not. I think the kind of political action, the model, of course, is Marxism, unity of theory and practice. You have to know the shape of the historical process. You have to identify the actors who are coming into their own, the future power of the proletariat or of some other group. You have to be on the side of history, and the social theory tells you how to do that. I do believe that you need to know something about the world in order to act in the world. But I'm not sure about the necessity of the kind of overriding, totalizing political social theory that Marxism represents. I'm not sure that that's what you need to be politically successful. Let me describe two different kinds of movements. One is a movement of people who are defending themselves. The workers, the working class movement, the labor movement of the 19th and 20th century was a movement of people defending themselves. And then there are movements like the anti-war movement in the United States in the 60s, where we are expressing solidarity with or opposition to actions that are going on someplace else that are not, we are not materially engaged. So there is a movement of people who are acting in their own interests, and there is a movement of people who are acting in the interests of others. And the role of social theorists is different in those two movements. The role of intellectuals is different in those two movements. In a movement of people acting in their own interests, intellectuals may provide a kind of theory that helps initiate the movement, that gives it some structure. But they will lose out in the end to the people who are acting in their own interests. This is Lenin's distinction between revolutionary consciousness and trade union consciousness. If the workers are acting successfully in their own interests, trade union consciousness will always win over revolutionary consciousness. And we want that. That is the democratic victory. It means that the movement is in the hands of the people who need it. If the working class is underdeveloped, very weak, repressed by the state, then you may get the triumph of a revolutionary consciousness, as in Russian history, and that's not an outcome that we should look forward to. In the anti-war movement in the United States, there were two groups of people. There were the revolutionary people who thought that this was a global struggle against imperialism, and the aim was to triumph, to overthrow the imperial state. And then there were the rest of us, a majority, I think, of the people in the demonstrations on the street, who believed the goal was to stop the war. And in a movement like this, where self-interest isn't involved, the people with revolutionary consciousness, who were the Maoists and the Trotskyists and the weather people, they ended up shaping the movement much more, because the ones who just wanted to stop the war didn't have the same level of commitment, didn't have the ideological stamina. So what I would argue for, I would argue for the modesty of social theorists and bourgeois intellectuals in working class movements, in Black movements. We should try to be helpful. We should offer advice, but the movements have to be run by the people whose interests are at stake. They have to produce leaders and discipline. And we should be ready to support those leaders as they appear, even if they are not ideologically committed to whatever goals, overreaching goals we have. I've always been an opponent of vanguard politics, and the politics of people who know the course of history tends to be vanguard politics, and I think vanguard politics is dangerous to the left. It has its moment, perhaps, at the very beginning of a social movement, but at some point, it's very important that the vanguard step back and the rear guard take over. I don't know if that responds to your first question, which I didn't quite understand.
Okay. Okay, now we have 4 more persons who posed the questions, and I let 2 persons in for the moment. I will first give word to Jane to ask her question, and then Patrun Sudorina, if I'm pronouncing well, and then the next round will be 2 colleagues from here, from Serbia, one actually who is biologist, and that's very rare that we have someone who is not social scientist or humanist in our discussion, so it will be very interesting to hear from him. And finally, our colleague from the Institute, Sasha Fatic. And if we have time left, I will read one question, because Milica, who posed it, she cannot join here in person, but let's hear for the beginning Jane, and then we are going to continue.
Hi, Professor Walzer. It's been an honor to hear you today. You addressed part of my question a little bit earlier. What I wrote was that the trigger for the Black Lives Matter movement was ostensibly the police killing of George Floyd, but there have been many police atrocities against African Americans throughout US history, In fact, there was the beating of Rodney King, which caused riots in LA, but not a nationwide movement. And so I had wondered if the current Black Lives Movement was more a manifestation of the pressures of 4 years of Trump's racism and white supremacy. And I also wondered if there was a missed opportunity in not connecting the Black Lives Matter citizen politics to electoral politics. When they sort of seized upon the phrase defund the police, which you talked a little bit about, which I suspected you would not be a fan of, that phrase was embraced by younger people, but it troubled older people, including Vice President Biden. So was this a question of the movement not defining the issue in a way that you could connect it to a candidate and make this, translate this movement into electoral politics?
Yes, I think there has been a failure of Black Lives Matter to endorse candidates and to activate its it doesn't have members, but to activate its activists in to get them to register and to vote. And that does not mean giving up on the movement politics and responding to each police atrocity. But it is so hard to locate the leaders of this movement, or to figure out how they decided, more or less, whoever they are, to focus on police abolition or police defunding, rather than on a whole series of reform efforts that might have been politically more promising. I suspect that what happens in a leaderless movement is that the loudest voices, the most manipulative voices, take over, and they decide without ever being accountable. They decide on what is being proposed or advocated or called for, in this case, I think, for understandable reasons, because reform efforts have failed. They chose to advocate for what you might call radical transformations, which are not in the cards and which don't have support in their own community, don't have the kind of support that would be necessary in their own community. So that is a problem of the contemporary left, because there is a whole ideology of leaderlessness and decentralization, which simply opens the way for the loudest voice.
Thanks a lot. Patronsu.
Hello, Professor Walzer. I'm very glad to see.
I can't hear you.
You have to be louder.
Okay. I said hello. I'm very honored to see and hear you. Spheres of Justice is a book very dear to me. And I thank you all for this opportunity to see Professor Walzer. So if I understood well, in order to be politically active, it is necessary to assume not only the loss of freedom, but also of life. In this order, how could this kind of democratic duty could be reconciled with the utilitarian mentality, according to which rational and free individuals will connect their actions, including the political actions, to the disadvantages they anticipate? And the second question, how could this moral requirement be institutionally or democratically implemented? Thank you very much.
Gisela, I'm not sure I heard all of that.
Yes, I'm sorry for that. I wrote my questions on chat.
I can read it if it's necessary. So,
okay.
So she said, in order to be politically active, it is necessary to assume not only the loss of freedom, but also of life. How can we reconcile this kind of democratic duty with the utilitarian mentality, according to which individuals will connect their actions to their advantages or disadvantages they anticipate? And also how this moral requirement could be institutionally implemented?
Well, I'm not against that utilitarian calculation. We do want Americans, for example, to defend their material and moral, psychological interests. But we also want those interests to be understood in ways that that connect them to a democratic politics. I've never been sympathetic to the notion of false consciousness, because I believe that, excuse me one moment, you should get lunch and go home. I have to stay another half hour.
Oh, I'm not gonna go home. I'll leave you here. Or should I go home?
20 minutes. We are finishing in 20 minutes. So.
Yes. So we want people acting in their own interests. We have to help them, I guess, understand their interests in a way that connects them to other people and to democratic politics. I don't know quite how to deal with what is now going on in the social media. The extent of political deception, dishonesty, without parallel in my lifetime, and I feel that this has to be, since I'm not on the social media, I'm not on Facebook, I don't tweet, I don't read Twitter, I don't know very much about what's going on in that whole world. But a lot of what's going on is the misrepresentation of reality. And I think that it's going to be the next generation or the generation after that of men and women who are going to have to deal with that, because I feel out of it. I feel incapable of understanding a life lived on the social media as they are today. And I don't know how to address the radical misunderstanding of the real world. We always talked about you have to adjust your politics to the real world. But now the real world is something that requires defense. Before you have to be able to describe it before you can act effectively in it. And so it's not, I don't think we need to be against individual utilitarian calculations if those calculations are made with full knowledge of what we call the real world. That I have philosophical disagreements with utilitarianism, but they aren't important right here. We need people acting right now in their interests but those interests have to be understood, and the fight for that simple understanding of the world. It's amazing. We have a president of the United States who is campaigning in states where the rate of COVID infections, the rate of hospitalization is rising in extraordinary, dangerous ways, and he is telling the people that this isn't a problem. We have turned the corner. So that's and there are social media which are endorsing that position and defending it, and it is a world, I have to confess, I don't understand.
The confession which we mostly share in the most of the time nowadays. Thank you. Miroslav? Just a second, I'm trying to unmute him. Ah, okay, you're in.
Okay. Do you hear me?
You need to be loud.
Oh, okay. Do you hear me now? Do you hear me?
No.
I can hear you, but I think that Professor Walzer cannot really hear you.
I'm not very versed in the Zoom. Is it okay now? No?
Is it better?
No, I can't.
Okay, can you ask and I will repeat?
3 years ago, I read a book on the biography of Mussolini by an English author. Unfortunately, I forgot the author. And now we live while reading the book, every page was so similar to our situation here, where we are living. That is in Serbia. Now, Professor Walzer mentioned some of these things, including the weakness of trade unions and the syndicates. So my question is, if there is 750,000 members of this ruling party, of a population of about 7 million, how can we change this not very likable government? And the only thing, we know how the elections passed, the only thing is a revolution, which Professor Walzer said is not very agreeable, or a coup by some enlightened group, either military or police, I don't know. But again, coups are very dangerous because they can be chronic. Like, for instance, in history, Bolivia is a typical example of coups occurring very often. Now, how can we get out of this vicious circle?
Okay. Thank you, Miroslav. I will try, because I read also what you wrote in the chat. I will try now to say. Well, he read a book about Mussolini recently, and the book is describing actually very much the Serbian current situation. It resembles a lot what is happening in Serbia, as Miroslav says. Especially, he's referring to situation that we have 750,000 members as members of the ruling party, which is more than 10% of the total population. And in comparison, in ex-Yugoslavia, which had 22 million, only 1 million were members of the Communist Party. And that was like one-party system back then. So he claims that there is no way to peacefully change the political leader. So you were talking about peaceful change, and he says that it's only by losing a war, which we already had in our case in Balkans, or by revolution, which is not preferred by you also, or by a coup, which will be implemented by some enlightened group, we can change the things. So what do you think? How basically to exit this vicious circle which we are in for the moment?
Yes, well, Political Action, the book, was written for the citizens of a functioning democracy. And the anti-revolutionary politics that I am defending is the politics that seems to me to be legitimate in a functioning democracy. I recognize that that there are regimes which make other forms of political action necessary. I am not an opponent of, say, the American Revolution, and when I think of the French Revolution, was it a good thing? And you remember the comment of Chou En-lai when asked if the French Revolution was a good thing, and he said it's too soon to tell. I don't agree with that. I think that the revolution was a good thing until the terror. And the problem with revolutionary politics is it has led so often to terrorism and authoritarianism. And so we need to think about when we are faced with a regime that can only be changed by some form of revolutionary action, we need to think about what kind of revolutionary action. We need an account of revolutionary politics, like my account of democratic movement politics. And that has to be a revolutionary politics that excludes terror. And I have at various times tried to write about some of those issues. I have a book about the killing of the king in the French Revolution. It's a collection of speeches at the trial, but I have a 100-page introduction in which I defend the trial of the king and oppose the Jacobin position, which was he should have just been killed without a trial, or with the kind of trial that didn't fit anyone's legal standards. So there are points in a revolutionary process where you can say yes here and no there, and if you are thinking about a revolution, you'd better begin thinking in advance about the points where you would say yes and the points where you would say no.
Thanks a lot for the answer. Well, Sasha, you're the last speaker, and then if time allows us, I will read one more question we had.
Thanks very much, Gazella. Thank you, Professor Walzer. This was an extremely stimulating talk and a discussion.
The sound is not coming through.
Can you hear me now?
Barely. If you talk.
Barely. Let me try to do something about it very quickly, if I can. Just a second. Is it any better now?
A little better.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. My question relates to your remarks about leadership. You mentioned that the left has systematically neglected leadership and also discipline. The discipline that comes along with the leadership. Now, my question is really about the nature of the leadership which you envisage as necessary on the left. I mean, if we observe how people behave, we see that these days in most countries, people tend to bandwagon behind hierarchical leaders. And
Yeah, I'm not hearing you now.
can you hear me? Gazella, perhaps you could retell my question. Yeah, my question is in core form. Do you envisage leadership as hierarchical leadership in the sense of discipline and following? Or do you envisage a non-hierarchical leadership which is based on the empowerment of those who are being led? And in the latter case, if that's what you mean, how do you avoid populism?
Yeah, I think I understood. You want an accountable leadership. So hierarchy probably isn't the right way of thinking about it. Think for a minute about Martin Luther King in the American Civil Rights Movement. He was the kind of national leader that a lot of leftists don't like, the big man. But if you went south, he, among the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, among the Baptist preachers, he wasn't that kind of a leader. He was a first among equals, but there were other powerful figures who shared in the decision-making of the SCLC. So that is a model, not the national role of King, but the role in the South, and in the SCLC. So you need leaders who are answerable to others. Now, the others will be, first of all, a smaller group, some kind of executive committee, or and then to a membership, to the activists in the movement. If the organization has branches, then there are going to be a lot of local leaders, and then there has to be some way of bringing the local leaders together so that they can choose someone who can speak nationally for the movement. So the model is a democratic model, and I agree that you have to be wary of in a democratic political movement. You have to be wary of the great man, and the entourage around him, where everybody is telling him how wonderful he is. That's what you have to avoid.
Okay. And one final question, which I'm going to read now. There are some attempts to explain almost total absence of meaningful and long-lasting political action outside corrupt parties, both ruling and in opposition in Serbia, by referring to one-party rule of socialist Yugoslavia or to Yugoslavia as such, seen by some as an obstacle to completion of Serbian national project, or to 500-year-long Ottoman rule, etc. All those theories suggest submissiveness of the people as the main culprit for this problem. A minority interpretation proposed that perhaps it's not that the people are submissive due to some distant past influences, but that it could be a guilty conscience of the more recent past, burdened by the support to the wars of the 19th and the war crimes committed in our name. Was the white guilt used or useful for civil rights movements in the United States in 60s and 70s? And is the racial tension today the result of this guilt not being properly addressed and resolved? That was the final question.
Yeah. Well, I think that the political movements aiming at a goal like ending the war can simply succeed, and then everybody goes home. And there is no institutional residue. I mean, we didn't succeed in ending the war, but we made it more and more difficult for America to fight the war, and that eventually brought it to an end. But most political movements for social change, for greater equality, for civil rights, are movements that are going to win partial victories. And that means that the struggle will have to be renewed later on. A victory like the Voting Rights Act of '65 pushed by Lyndon Johnson, a victory like that does to some degree disable the movement. People think, okay, now we can do something else. And then because the victory is incomplete and because there is always counter opposition that tries to regain what was lost, what we won, what they lost, the struggle always has to be renewed. There is no end. I think that is one of the most important lessons of citizen politics. It is steady work. And maybe I'll end by explaining that phrase because it comes from an old Yiddish joke. A small Jewish town in Poland appointed a man to stand outside the entrance to the town and watch for the Messiah. And because the people wanted to be warned that the Messiah was coming. And somebody said to this man, well, that's a very strange job. And he replied, it doesn't pay very well, but it's steady work. That's left politics.
Well, that's a great conclusion for this session, I have to say, really. Thank you very much for joining us. We are very sorry that we couldn't have you in person here, but I know it's difficult. The situation around us is very difficult, and we are very happy and honored that we were able to host you using these technological means, which are making it easier today to think together and act together, basically. Once more, thank you all for joining us for this session. I'm thanking you on behalf of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at University of Belgrade, who hosted the event, and its partner institution, Center for Advanced Studies of University in Rijeka, which is together with us organizing this whole series. It was a pleasure to have Professor Walzer as the first in the round. Tomorrow, actually, it's by coincidence that we had two in a row in 2 days. We are continuing with Yanis Varoufakis, so different side of the spectrum. And thank you all for joining us tonight, or this day in the United States.
Yes, and thank you very much for organizing, making possible this this meeting.
It was a pleasure for us, really, and very useful for us also. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. See you soon.
You.
We will talk.
We will. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.